A black little girl shouts, "Don't eat that," and in an instant, a billionaire freezes. The first-class cabin falls silent. Forks hovering mid-air. Conversations cut short. Passengers turn to stare, their eyes flicking between the powerful man in the tailored suit and the small child trembling in her seat. At first, he dismisses it. Just a child being dramatic. Just another fleeting moment in a world that bends to his will. But then, she says something that makes his blood run cold. "My daddy got sick from food like that. It was poisoned." What happens next no one saw coming. The billionaire, a man accustomed to controlling narratives, is suddenly forced to confront a truth he's spent years ignoring. A scandal brews. A past he buried rises to the surface. And as the walls of his empire begin to crack, one question lingers in the air. What does he do now? Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the heaviest truths. Jonathan Ellsworth never liked airports. He never liked the way the air smelled sterile, humming with the residue of too many lives passing through in too little time. He had traveled enough, more than most, enough to know that every airport was the same. They were places of transit. Liminal spaces where people came and went. Always in a hurry. Never belonging. And Jonathan Ellsworth did not like to feel like he did not belong. A man of his stature, one whose name alone could shift markets and send corporate boards into a frenzy, was not accustomed to discomfort. Yet, on this particular morning, as he walked through the gleaming terminal, dragging a sleek silver suitcase behind him, something felt off. It was not just the trip. Though it had been hastily arranged. It was not just the scandal brewing in the background. The whispers that his company, Ellsworth Global, had been complicit in something unsavory. Something buried deep in the bowels of international trade where most men of his class never looked too closely. No, it was something else. The weight in his chest. The sense that something was waiting for him. Something beyond his control. "Sir, the gate's just ahead," murmured his assistant, Michael Yan, a younger man with sharp eyes hidden behind wireframe glasses. Jonathan only nodded, his grip tightening around the suitcase handle. He had never been the type to be rattled. He had survived boardroom battles with men twice as ruthless as him. Navigated the labyrinth of power and wealth with the ease of someone born into it. And yet there it was. The feeling. Eyes. He had felt it before. But never so pronounced. He knew how people looked at men like him. Not just for his wealth but for the invisible chasm that separated him from the rest of the world. That distance, that divide, was something he had carefully cultivated over the years. Power was about control, and control meant never letting people see too much. But today, something was different. There, at the gate, among the tired faces of travelers and the manufactured smiles of flight attendants, sat a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her small hands gripping a tattered stuffed rabbit. Her dark skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. Her mother, a woman in a simple but well-worn dress, sat beside her, scrolling through a phone with tired, distracted fingers. Jonathan barely registered them at first. A mother and child, traveling coach, likely on their way to visit family or returning home from some quiet, unremarkable place. But then the girl looked up and locked eyes with him. It was a fleeting moment. But something in her gaze unsettled him. It was not curiosity, not the vague awe or envy he sometimes saw from those who recognized him but did not dare approach. It was something else. Recognition? No. Something closer to knowing. Jonathan forced himself to look away, reminding himself that he had no time for absurdities. His focus had to be on London. On the investors waiting for him. On the conference where he would, once again, have to wear the mask of the visionary businessman, the philanthropist. The flight was announced. First-class passengers were called. Jonathan straightened his cuffs, exhaled slowly, and moved forward. The girl, still watching, whispered something to her mother. He did not hear it. He did not know, not yet, that in just a few hours, that whisper would bring his world to the edge of unraveling. At first, everything felt routine. The soft hum of polite voices. The The mechanical smiles of flight attendants. The orchestrated luxury of first-class, a world designed for men like Jonathan Ellsworth. A world where the air was heavier, scented with expensive cologne and chilled champagne. Where the seats were wider and softer, built to accommodate the comfort of those who did not need to ask for it. Jonathan had spent decades in this space. This carefully constructed bubble where discomfort was a foreign concept. He knew the rules here. How to command respect with a glance. How to dismiss a waiter with a flick of his wrist. How to nod just enough at the pleasantries without ever truly acknowledging the people who offered them. And yet, the girl had unsettled him. It was irrational, absurd even, but he could still feel her eyes on him long after he had settled into his seat. A child, a black child, staring at him as though she had seen something inside of him that no one else had. He exhaled, adjusting his watch, his cufflinks. Would you like a drink before takeoff, Mr. Ellsworth? The flight attendant's voice was polished, rehearsed to the point of perfection. Scotch. Neat. She nodded, stepping away with the efficiency of someone who had served enough billionaires to know that time was money and conversation was not necessary. Michael, seated beside him, tapped away on his tablet. We've finalized the deck for London. The environmental numbers are stronger than expected, should play well with the press. We'll frame the investment as a humanitarian initiative, but we'll still push the market viability angle. Jonathan nodded, only half listening. His mind drifted back to the reports. The accusations. The quiet, growing murmur of something ugly brewing beneath the surface of his empire. He was still thinking about it when the seatbelt sign flickered on. And the plane began its ascent. Then, just as the tension in the cabin eased, just as glasses were lifted and murmurs of conversation resumed, there was a voice. Soft at first, then louder. Mommy, I don't think he should eat that. Jonathan's pulse tightened. He turned slightly, enough to see the girl. Naomi, just a few seats ahead. Her mother, Angela, hushed her, but the child's eyes were fixed on him. Why him? The attendant returned, placing the glass of scotch before him. Then setting down the first course of the flight's exclusive menu, a seafood dish draped in delicate saffron sauce. The kind of meal designed to remind passengers that they were separate from the world below. That their altitude also extended to their place in life. Jonathan lifted his fork. Then, don't eat that. The words shot through the cabin like a gunshot. Heads turned. A ripple of movement passed through the first-class cabin. Eyes flicking between Jonathan and the small girl who now sat rigid in her seat. Her face tight with fear. Angela's face flushed as she pulled Naomi close, whispering something urgent. Apologies. No doubt. Explanations. Excuses. Jonathan set his fork down. Slowly. His throat was suddenly dry. A flight attendant approached, her professional poise faltering just slightly. Is everything all right here? Naomi's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her tray. He shouldn't eat it, she said again, voice smaller but still insistent. My daddy got sick from food like that. From bad water. From something inside the fish. He said. Her voice wavered, but she did not look away from Jonathan. He felt something shift inside him. Something uncomfortable. Something dangerous. Angela swallowed hard, her eyes darting between her daughter and the powerful man sitting just a few feet away. I'm so sorry, sir. Naomi she gets nervous sometimes about certain foods. But the girl did not back down. It's not just any food. It's this food. Jonathan studied her. She was a child. Yes, but there was something old in her eyes. Something knowing. Something that made his stomach twist. Though he did not know why. The flight attendant, sensing the awkwardness thickening in the air, turned to Jonathan with her perfectly trained smile. Mr. Ellsworth, would you like me to replace your meal with something else? We have other options. Jonathan opened his mouth, ready to dismiss the girl's outburst as childish paranoia. But something made him pause. Instead, he turned to Naomi. Why do you think it's dangerous? The question hung between them. Angela tensed, eyes wide. Passengers were listening now, their gazes flicking between them. Between the powerful white man in the tailored suit and the small black girl who had dared to raise her voice. Naomi swallowed. Because my daddy ate fish from the water near his job, and he got sick. He said the water had something in it. Something bad. And it came from a company. Her voice wavered, but she clenched her fists. A big company. The words landed like a stone in Jonathan's chest. His fingers tightened around the glass of scotch. Angela rushed to smooth things over. She's just a child, sir. I'm sure it's nothing personal. But it was too late. The silence that followed was heavy. Unrelenting. Jonathan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, threatening to unravel something carefully stitched together over decades. The accusation was not direct. But it was there, floating in the air between them. Undeniable. The child had spoken. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Ellsworth did not know what to say. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air inside the first-class cabin had thickened, weighted by the tension of too many unsaid things. The kind of silence that didn't just sit, it pressed. It accused. It judged. Jonathan Ellsworth was used to silence. He had mastered it, bent it to his will in boardrooms where hesitation could cost billions. Where the right pause could hold an entire room hostage. But this silence was different. This was not the silence of power. This was the silence of a wound. Deep and festering. He was aware, acutely aware, of the way people were watching. The man in 2A, pretending to scroll through his tablet but listening intently. The older white couple across the aisle. Their faces tightening in that peculiar way that people's faces tighten when race enters the conversation but is never spoken out loud. And of course, there was her, the girl, Naomi. She had not broken eye contact. Even as her mother murmured hushed apologies beside her. Even as the flight attendants scrambled to smooth over the moment. Jonathan had always prided himself on his ability to navigate tension, to sidestep controversy, to never allow himself to be the villain of any story that wasn't entirely under his control. But this was something else. Slowly, carefully, he placed his fork down on the linen-covered tray. His voice was measured, deliberate. You said your father got sick? Angela stiffened beside Naomi, her posture drawing up not hostile, but cautious. That particular kind of caution that black parents learn to carry when dealing with powerful white men. He worked in West Africa, she said, her voice soft but steady. In a coastal town. He was part of a development project, at least that's what they called it. But after a while, the people started getting sick. The fish, she hesitated. The fish they lived on. The fish they sold. It was poisoned. The water had changed. My husband, she let out a breath, as if to keep herself from saying too much. Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. A coincidence, surely, but something inside him, a sharp, familiar voice. The voice that had whispered warnings at him for months now told him it wasn't. Michael, beside him, was still tapping on his tablet, pretending not to notice, but Jonathan could feel his discomfort radiating. The flight attendant, ever professional, cleared her throat lightly. Mr. Ellsworth, would you like me to bring you a different meal? It was an out, an escape. He could take it, say nothing, smile, nod, accept a different plate of food, make a joke about children and their wild imaginations. The world would move on. The world always moved on. Jonathan lifted his gaze. Naomi was still watching him, waiting. His voice, when it came, was lower than he expected. No. The flight attendant blinked. Sir? Jonathan straightened. No, I won't be eating it. A visible shift in the cabin. A rustling of movement. The man in 2A finally looked up. The older couple exchanged glances. Even Michael paused, his fingers still hovering over the screen. Naomi's mouth parted slightly. She had expected him to dismiss her, to ignore, to move on. So had everyone else. And yet, he had set down his fork. Angela exhaled, her shoulders easing just slightly. The tension in the room did not break, it did not disappear, but it changed. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Quiet but unmistakable. A conversation had begun. Not in words, but in the way people sat differently now. In the way eyes shifted. In the way assumptions had been unsettled. Naomi, after a long moment, nodded. And then slowly, cautiously she turned back to her tray. Her small hands trembling slightly as she picked up her fork. Jonathan reached for his glass of scotch. But when he lifted it to his lips, he realized that his hands were shaking too. Something had shifted. A fault line had cracked open beneath his feet. And though no one had said it aloud, though no headlines had been written yet, though no accusations had been formally spoken, he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that his world would not be the same when this flight landed. The plane hummed at 30,000 feet. A quiet mechanical pulse against the thick silence that had settled over the first-class cabin. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and indifferent. But inside, something had shifted. Jonathan Ellsworth could feel it. The girl had spoken. And now, the walls he had spent a lifetime fortifying, the walls between himself and consequence. Between himself and history. Between himself and the people his empire had touched were beginning to crack. He had set his fork down. He had refused the meal. And though no one had said a word about it since, he could feel the weight of it pressing into every glance, every measured breath. His assistant, Michael, cleared his throat. A quiet sound, but in the silence, it may as well have been a gunshot. "Sir," he murmured, voice low enough that no one else could hear. "We should discuss the press strategy for London." Jonathan turned his head slightly. He knew what Michael meant. The rumors were already out there, whispers of corruption, of poisoned land, of villages sickened by chemicals that bore the invisible fingerprints of companies Jonathan had long since stopped keeping track of. But whispers were easy to dismiss. Whispers were not facts. Except now, in the seat ahead of him, sat a little girl who had unknowingly turned a whisper into something undeniable. Jonathan exhaled. "Later." Michael hesitated. "Sir." I said later." Michael nodded once but didn't look convinced. Jonathan lifted his glass of scotch again. But this time, when he took a sip, it burned differently. Ahead of him, Naomi shifted in her seat. She was no longer staring at him. But he could tell somehow that she was still watching. The minutes dragged. The flight attendants had resumed their routine. Serving drinks, refilling glasses, moving through the aisles with mechanical efficiency. But the air had not settled. It never truly settled after a moment like that. Somewhere behind them, in economy, the world moved as it always did, parents entertaining restless children, businessmen scrolling through emails, passengers slipping into half-sleep. But here, in first class, where the air was conditioned and the wine was aged and the seats were wider than the average coffin, the weight of the unspoken had become unbearable. Jonathan forced himself to focus. He reached for his tablet, scrolled mindlessly through the agenda for London. He had meetings with investors, a press conference, a carefully crafted statement about his company's commitment to sustainability, words that had been polished to a fine, meaningless sheen by a team of speechwriters. "The future is green," it read. He nearly laughed. He was still staring at the words when Michael's voice cut through his thoughts again. "Tighter this time, sir." Jonathan looked up. Michael's face was pale, his fingers gripping the tablet. "We have a problem," he whispered. Jonathan's stomach tightened. Michael turned the screen toward him. A news article had surfaced, a small one, buried on an independent website. But it was spreading fast. Ellsworth Global tied to toxic waste scandal in West Africa. Below the headline, a photo, a coastline, once lush, now scorched. Dead fish littered the shore. Children in tattered clothes stood ankle-deep in poisoned water. Jonathan's pulse quickened. His name was not in the article, not yet, but it didn't have to be. The companies involved were subsidiaries of subsidiaries, buried under layers of corporate shielding. But he knew. And someone else knew, too. The girl's father. The girl's mother. Naomi. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the seat ahead of him. She had said it so simply. So plainly. "My daddy got sick." Not with malice. Not with accusation. Just fact. And now, the world was beginning to catch up. The turbulence hit suddenly. A jolt. Sharp and immediate. Shaking the cabin like a warning. Glasses rattled. Naomi let out a small gasp as her tray trembled. Jonathan tightened his grip on the armrest, feeling his pulse in his throat. The pilot's voice crackled through the speaker. Calm. Controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Jonathan exhaled slowly. But his heart did not slow. Because this was no longer about the plane. This was about the storm waiting for him when they landed. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress of wealth, of power, of distance. But no fortress was impenetrable. And now, a crack had formed. A small one. A child-sized one. But it was growing. Jonathan closed his eyes, listening to the engine's hum, to the quiet rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. He thought about the headline. He thought about the poisoned coastline. He thought about Naomi's voice, cutting through the silence. And he knew, this was only the beginning. The turbulence subsided, but the unease did not. It lingered in the cabin, clinging to the recycled air like something unspoken, something unfinished. Jonathan Ellsworth sat rigid in his seat, his hand still gripping the armrest. His eyes burned into the screen of Michael's tablet, where the words from the news article blurred and sharpened in turns. Ellsworth Global tied to toxic waste scandal in West Africa. He could feel it happening, the slow unraveling. He had built a life of carefully managed optics, a philanthropy that concealed the cracks beneath the surface. But now, those cracks were widening, spreading like fault lines under the weight of a child's voice, under the weight of a poisoned sea. My daddy got sick. The words echoed. Too simple, too true. Michael shifted beside him. It's small for now, he murmured. Not mainstream yet. Yet. Jonathan inhaled slowly, forcing himself back into the present. What's the source? Michael hesitated. An independent journalist, someone local. The kind of story that usually dies on arrival. Usually. But something about this wasn't usual. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the seat in front of him. Naomi sat quietly, scribbling in a small notebook. Her face calm, as if nothing had happened. As if she had not just, in her own way, set off a chain reaction. He turned back to Michael. Contact PR. Get ahead of it. Michael nodded. Already typing. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling. He was good at this. Controlling the story, framing the narrative, redirecting attention. But for the first time in a long time, something gnawed at him. Because this wasn't just a headline. This wasn't just another crisis to spin. This was real. He had known, somewhere in the far recesses of his mind, that these things happened, that numbers on a quarterly report translated to something tangible. Something human. He had known, but he had not felt it. Until now. Until a little girl had looked him in the eye and told him the truth. And the truth had felt like a weight on his chest. One he could not shake. The flight dragged forward, time stretching and contracting. The attendants moved through the aisles again, their smiles polite but strained. The tension still clinging to the air. People were talking. Jonathan could hear it, the whispered speculations. The half-conversations spoken just softly enough to be deniable. Did you hear the girl? Something about poisoned fish? God, people get so dramatic. But sometimes kids pick up on things adults ignore. He shut his eyes, but he could still hear them. For the first time in years, he was not the one controlling the room. The plane began its descent. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Heathrow. Below, the city stretched wide, a maze of old and new, of power and history. Jonathan had been to London too many times to count. It had always been a city of transactions for him, a place where deals were struck, where power moved in rooms lined with mahogany and leather. But this time, something was different. This time, something was waiting for him. The seatbelt sign dinged. The attendants bustled through the cabin, checking latches, securing trays. Naomi stirred, stretching her arms. And then, just as the wheels touched the ground, just as the engines roared their final protest against gravity, Jonathan heard it. A voice, small, but certain. Naomi, whispering to her mother. Do you think he knew? Jonathan's breath caught. Angela hesitated. Her voice was soft, but her answer was firm. They always know. Jonathan closed his eyes. And this time, he did not have an answer. The plane had landed, but Jonathan Ellsworth was still falling. He moved through Heathrow in a haze. His steps practiced but heavy. His mind cluttered with noise. The murmurs in first class had not stopped at the cabin doors. They followed him into the jet bridge. Then through customs. then out into the cavernous airport where a driver in a dark suit stood waiting, holding a sign with his name. Ellsworth. The name meant something here. It meant wealth. It meant power. It meant that men in glass towers would wait for him. That reporters would frame their questions just carefully enough to keep his favor. That entire industries would shift based on what he said next. But today, it meant something else. It meant guilt. It meant the sickly weight in his gut as Naomi's voice played over and over again in his mind. Do you think he knew? They always know. The driver opened the car door, and Jonathan stepped inside. London rushed past the tinted windows. The old and the new stacked against each other, the history of empire written in every stone. The British knew how to erase things. How to smooth over blood-stained foundations with marble and steel. They had done it for centuries. And so had he. Jonathan had always understood power, what it looked like. How to wield it. How to survive within it. And power, in his world, had always been about control. Controlling the narrative. Controlling perception. Controlling distance. But what happened when control slipped? What happened when a child could look at a man worth billions and unearth the truth with a single question? Do you think he knew? Jonathan closed his eyes. The hotel was grand. The kind of place where rooms were bigger than most London flats. Where the lobby smelled of fresh flowers and old money. Michael was already waiting in the suite. A stack of reports spread across the coffee table. He had not wasted time. We have a problem, Michael said. Without preamble. Jonathan didn't sit. Tell me something I don't know. Michael's jaw tensed. The article is picking up traction. Small outlets. But it's moving fast. People are talking. Jonathan exhaled. And? Michael hesitated. Then slid a folder across the table. There's more. Jonathan opened it. The words on the page hit him like a punch. The article had evolved. The accusations were no longer vague. Someone had named names. Not his directly, not yet, but the companies tied to Ellsworth Global were now on full display. A supply chain of destruction. Woven into the fine print of contracts and shell companies. And buried within the article. A single, damning paragraph. Sources indicate that the contamination originated from industrial projects linked to a US-based conglomerate. Though no official statement has been made. Leaked documents suggest corporate knowledge of the environmental impact as early as 3 years ago. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Where did they get this? Michael shook his head. We don't know. But it's out now. And it won't stop. Jonathan swallowed. His throat dry. He had handled crises before. He had watched accusations rise and fall like tides. Disappearing as soon as the world found something else to be outraged about. But this felt different. Because it was not just a scandal. It was real. It had a face. A name. A small voice. Trembling but resolute. My daddy got sick. Jonathan sank into the chair. Rubbing his temple. What do we do? Michael's voice was careful. We can deny. Shift blame. Redirect. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And when they find more? Michael hesitated. Then we manage the fallout. We spin it. He trailed off. Jonathan looked at him. Michael had worked for him for years. He had seen Jonathan navigate impossible situations. Had watched him wield power with precision and calculation. But today, Michael looked uncertain. Because today, there was no clear way out. Jonathan leaned back, his eyes on the ceiling. There was a way to survive this. There was always a way. But survival was not the same as absolution. The phone rang. Jonathan stared at it for a long moment before picking up. A familiar voice on the other end. Cold, calculated. A board member. A man who had shaken Jonathan's hand at a fundraiser only weeks ago. A man who had once toasted to his vision. Jonathan, the man said. Smooth and steady. We need to talk. Jonathan closed his eyes. I know. A pause. You have a decision to make. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the phone. I know. He knew what they wanted. A statement. A clean up. A quiet resolution. They wanted him to say that the problem wasn't his. That it was a mistake. A logistical error. That the suffering was regrettable but unavoidable. They wanted him to lie. And for the first time in his career, Jonathan Ellsworth didn't know if he could. Because now, every time he tried to push it away, He saw Naomi's face. He heard her voice. Do you think he knew? They always know. And the truth was she was right. He had always known. And now, the whole world would know too. The city moved outside the glass. But Jonathan Ellsworth remained still. He sat in his hotel suite. The curtains drawn. The world outside muted by the thick, impenetrable silence of power unraveling. His phone lay face down on the table, buzzing intermittently with calls he had no intention of answering. The board, the press, investors demanding reassurance. There was no reassurance to give. Michael stood near the window, arms crossed, tension carved into every line of his face. The usual confidence had faded, replaced by something taut, something bordering on panic. They're expecting a statement, he said finally. Jonathan exhaled, slow and measured. What do they want me to say? Michael hesitated. That this isn't your responsibility. That the reports are exaggerated. That Ellsworth Global remains committed to. Jonathan cut him off with a raised hand. Committed to what, Michael? His voice was quieter than expected. Sustainability? Ethical practices? Responsibility? A beat of silence. Michael shifted. You knew what this was, he said, the words careful but pointed. You knew how the game worked. Jonathan let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. I did. He had built his empire on the certainty that money moved faster than consequences. That accountability could always be delayed, diluted, buried beneath legal jargon and shifting narratives. But now, that certainty had cracked, and at the center of the break was a little girl, sitting on an airplane, whispering to her mother. Do you think he knew? They always know. Jonathan had spent his life avoiding questions like that. And now, for the first time, he had no answer. The meeting was set for noon. The board had convened in a private conference room, high above the city, where the walls were thick enough to keep out the noise of the world below. Jonathan entered last. The men around the table were the kind of men who never had to raise their voices to be heard. Their power lay in the weight of their silence, in the way they could erase entire conversations with a single glance. He had been one of them. Now, he wasn't so sure. The chairman spoke first, his voice smooth, practiced. Jonathan, he said, we have a crisis. Jonathan's jaw tightened. So I've heard. We need to control the damage. Jonathan's fingers curled into his palm beneath the table. And how do you propose we do that? A pause. Then, measured words. We distance ourselves. Release a statement. Discredit the reports. We remind the public that there's no direct evidence tying Ellsworth Global to this situation. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Situation. The chairman nodded. A regrettable one, of course. Regrettable. A word that men like this used when the blood was on someone else's hands. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished mahogany. And if there is evidence? Silence. Then, another voice, one of the older board members. A man with a face carved from marble. Then we make sure no one finds it. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This was the line. The one he had spent his career towing. Always careful never to cross. But now, he realized, he had already crossed it long ago. Outside, the city burned with movement. Protesters had begun to gather outside the conference venue. The article had spread beyond the independent sources, now it was everywhere. The BBC, The Times, CNN. The chants rose in waves, barely muffled by the thick glass of the boardroom. Ellsworth knew. Justice for the families. No more blood money. Jonathan's pulse pounded. This was no longer speculation. This was real. His phone buzzed again. A text this time. A number he didn't recognize. A single message. You can't ignore this anymore. He stared at it. Then, slowly, he stood. The men in the room stiffened slightly. The chairman narrowed his eyes. Jonathan? Jonathan looked around the table. At the faces of men who had built their lives on the illusion of control. He thought of the poisoned coastline. He thought of a father, lying in a hospital bed, his body wrecked by something Jonathan had profited from. He thought of a little girl, small but certain, saying words that had dismantled the foundation he had built his life on. They always know. Jonathan took a breath. And for the first time in his career, He made a decision not based on survival, but on truth. He turned to the chairman. And he said, "No." The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that was not passive but armed, waiting for the first move. Jonathan Ellsworth had just said the word that men in his position were never supposed to say. No. It was not loud, but it was final. The weight of it settled like an earthquake in the room, shaking the unspoken balance that had governed men like him for generations. The chairman's eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. "Jonathan, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation." Jonathan exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "No, I understand it perfectly." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against polished mahogany. Around him, the faces of men who had once been allies twisted into something else. "Where do you think you're going?" Jonathan straightened. "To tell the truth." A quiet scoff from the man across from him. One of the old ones. The ones who had built entire legacies on the bodies of people they would never meet. "Jonathan," he said, almost amused, "do you think you're clean in all this?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "No one at this table is clean," he admitted, "but some of us still have the choice to stop making things worse." A beat. Then laughter. Low at first, then spreading. A ripple of amusement laced with something darker. The chairman leaned back, hands folded neatly on the table. "You think you can survive this?" Jonathan met his gaze. "I think survival isn't the point anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out. The hotel lobby was chaos. Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted his name. Security moved to shield him. But Jonathan didn't stop. He had spent a lifetime avoiding this moment, controlling it before it could control him. But now, as the questions hit him like gunfire, as microphones were shoved toward his face, he felt something strange. He felt free. "Mr. Ellsworth, do you deny involvement in the West African contamination scandal? Will you be stepping down as CEO? Are you responsible for the deaths in?" Jonathan held up a hand. The noise wavered. And then, for the first time in his life, he spoke without a script. "There will be no denial," he said, voice steady, no distraction, no carefully crafted PR statement. "The truth is simple. I knew." A collective inhale from the press. "I knew, and I let it happen." The words should have felt like a death sentence. But instead, they felt like the first real thing he had ever said. Behind him, Michael had gone pale. The board members, watching from a distance, stood frozen. Jonathan exhaled. "I built an empire on silence," he continued, "on looking away, on treating people like numbers on a spreadsheet. And I won't do it anymore." A woman in the crowd, young. A reporter from an independent outlet, leaned forward. "What will you do now?" Jonathan hesitated. For the first time in years, he didn't know the answer. But then, through the chaos, through the blur of flashing lights and voices, he saw something. A woman, standing near the back, holding the hand of a little girl. "Angela." "Naomi." Jonathan's breath caught. The child stared at him, her expression unreadable. And then, slowly, so small that no one else would notice, she nodded. Jonathan swallowed hard. And then, softly, he nodded back. The fallout was immediate. The board called for his resignation. Stockholders panicked. The media exploded. Jonathan had lost everything in the span of a single press conference. And yet he had never felt lighter. Because for the first time in his life, he had done the one thing men like him were never supposed to do. He had listened. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.